Every historical drama, every textbook, every retelling of the Qing dynasty's fall blames a single castrated schemer whispering behind the throne. His name was Zhao Gao. He had a daughter, and her husband, an official named Yanle, governed the imperial capital. The most famous eunuch villain in Chinese history was never a eunuch, and the people who actually were, the castrated men who served in the deepest corridors of the Qing palace, faced a fate that no drama has ever depicted. The transformation of Zhao Gao into a castrated villain rests on a single corrupted word. Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian notes that Zhao Gao and his brothers were born in what the transmitted text renders as Yinggong. For centuries, commentators in the Eastern Han and Tang dynasties, eras when genuine eunuchs were tearing their courts apart, interpreted this as a reference to a castration facility. The reading was convenient. It allowed later historians to project their own era's catastrophes backward in time and construct a clean moral. Castrated men have always destroyed empires. Then 20th century archaeology intervened. The excavation of the Shuihudi and Zhangjiashan bamboo slips, administrative documents buried with low-ranking Qin officials, preserved the precise legal terminology of the era and revealed that the correct term was not Yinggong but Yingguan. In the Qing penal system, the Yingguan was a government-run labor compound where criminals who had completed their sentences but bore permanent physical mutilations, amputation, branding, castration, were housed and employed. Zhao Gao's mother had committed a crime, suffered a mutilating punishment, and been confined to the Yingguan. Her children inherited her marginalized legal status. They were born into poverty and stigma, not born castrated. And in the Qing era, nothing about serving in the inner court required castration. The title palace official, Huanguan, simply described someone working within the physical confines of the palace complex, a bureaucratic designation indicating access, clearance, and proximity to the sovereign, carrying no biological meaning whatsoever. A man listed on the palace registry could be fully intact, married, and raising a family. The modern conflation of that title with castrated eunuch did not solidify until the Eastern Han Dynasty, centuries later, when imperial decrees mandated that all inner court servants undergo castration. Later historians, reading backward through that lens, assumed the earlier system operated identically. Zhao Gao himself was a masterful calligrapher, a scholar of Qing law, and a man of notable physical strength, which is exactly why the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, appointed him prefect of the palace carriages, the role controlling the emperor's personal transportation and physical security. He was not a eunuch. He was something the system had no defense against, a brilliant, intact bureaucrat with unlimited access to the throne. The actual castrated men in the Qin palace were not political operatives. They were penal slaves produced by one of the most brutal legal codes in the ancient world. The Qin state utilized castration, palace punishment, gongxing, as one of its 5 punishments, applied for offenses ranging from sexual crimes to political dissent. The procedure was performed with a bronze or iron blade, without effective anesthesia. Survivors were confined to a sealed, heavily heated room known as a 蚕室, named for the warm, draft-free conditions required to rear silkworms, where they spent up to 100 days in recovery. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Those who emerged were biologically altered, socially erased, and reclassified as state property. They were then absorbed into the Yingguan system, where the Shuihudi bamboo slips record how the Qin state managed them. Adult male penal laborers received 2 measures of grain per month. Winter clothing was allocated at exactly 110 copper coins, summer at 55, and even convicts' children were assigned fractional rations calibrated to their height. The state defined adulthood not by age but by physical measurement. A male was considered capable of full labor at approximately 150 centimeters. Think about what that means for survival. These men owned no property, produced nothing independently, and depended entirely on state granaries for their daily rations, state workshops for their clothing, and state compounds for their shelter. If the centralized machine that measured and rationed their existence stopped running, they did not simply lose their positions, they lost their mechanism for staying alive. The Zhangjiashan bamboo slips preserve one case that captures the suffocating totality of this penal system. A laborer named Die, already bearing the scars of facial tattooing and nasal amputation, married a woman named Fu in an attempt at some fragment of ordinary life. He did not know she was a fugitive slave concealing her identity. Under Qing law, ignorance was no defense. The court sentenced Die to have his left toe amputated and returned him to hard labor. Even reaching for the most basic human connection resulted in further mutilation. And above the barracks of the Yingguan, within the polished halls of the palace, the first emperor's paranoia ensured that even privileged inner court attendants lived under a permanent death sentence. On one occasion, Qin Shi Huang observed his chancellor's oversized retinue from a hilltop and privately expressed displeasure. When the chancellor subsequently reduced his escort, having clearly been tipped off, the emperor concluded that an attendant had leaked his private remarks. Unable to identify which one, he ordered every attendant who had been present executed. This was the world Zhao Gao mastered. And when Qin Shi Huang died unexpectedly during a tour of the eastern provinces in 210 BCE, Zhao Gao exploited that mastery to fracture the dynasty from inside. The emperor died at a place called Sand Dune, hundreds of miles from the capital, in the searing heat of midsummer. Zhao Gao recognized immediately that the legitimate heir, Prince Fusu, would strip him of influence. Together with Chancellor Li Si, he suppressed the death and forged an imperial edict, ordering Fusu to commit suicide. The prince obeyed. The forged decree installed Zhao Gao's former student, the young and pliable Hu Hai, as the second emperor. To conceal the death during the weeks-long journey back to the capital, Zhao Gao ordered carts of salted fish stacked around the imperial carriage. In the suffocating July heat, the sweet odor of decomposition seeped through the sealed doors, and the rotting brine was the only screen between the conspiracy and its exposure. For weeks, the convoy crawled westward while attendants delivered meals through a gap in the carriage curtains and withdrew without entering, reading administrative reports aloud to a dead man as flies circled the procession in thick clouds. The stench clung to everything: robes, skin, the canvas of every tent pitched at nightfall. And through it all, Zhao Gao walked among the retinue, issuing orders in the emperor's name, drafting responses in the emperor's hand, sustaining the fiction of a living ruler, while the corpse blackened and swelled in the sealed carriage behind him. With Hu Hai on the throne, Zhao Gao moved to empty the imperial bloodline. 12 Qing princes were executed publicly in the capital marketplace. 10 princesses met their end by chariot. Li Si, the architect of Qing legalism, was subjected to every punishment in his own legal code before being bisected at the waist in the very marketplace where his laws had been proclaimed. When Li Si attempted to smuggle a memorial of innocence to the emperor, Zhao Gao intercepted it. His response was a single line: "How can a prisoner submit a memorial to the emperor?" The man who delivered that sentence was not a eunuch cowering behind curtains. He was the most powerful person in the empire, and he had achieved that power through legal expertise, bureaucratic capture, and the methodical elimination of everyone positioned to challenge him. The actual eunuchs, the castrated men laboring in the Yingguan, rationed by grain weight and measured by height, had no part in any of it. Zhao Gao had built his dominance within a functioning autocracy. He controlled the documents, the appointments, the information pipeline. But by 207 BCE, the empire he had commandeered was burning from the edges inward, and the only people left with physical access to the center of power were the ones the entire system had been designed to silence. Rebel armies, ignited by years of conscription and punitive cruelty, were converging on the mountain passes that guarded the Qian heartland. When the second emperor Hu Hai finally grasped the scale of the catastrophe, Zhao Gao struck preemptively. He dispatched his son-in-law Yan Le with over 1,000 soldiers to storm the emperor's residence at Wangyi Palace, holding Yan Le's own mother hostage to guarantee compliance. The guards were cut down. The attendants scattered into the corridors. And in the wreckage of the inner chambers, the emperor of the known world found himself accompanied by a single person, one unnamed attendant who had not fled. Hu Hai turned on him. Why hadn't the attendant warned him? Why hadn't anyone spoken? The man's reply has survived 22 centuries. He had not spoken precisely because speaking would have killed him. His silence was the only reason he was still breathing. Had he dared to say a single word against Zhao Gao, he would have been executed long ago. Put it this way, the most powerful man on earth had just discovered that the only honest person left in his palace was the one man who could never afford to be honest. His survival strategy had worked flawlessly. It had also guaranteed that the one person close enough to prevent a catastrophe was the one person who could never afford to try. Hu Hai was forced to take his own life. Zhao Gao seized the imperial seals and presented himself to the assembled court. The officials responded with total hostile silence, a collective refusal to acknowledge his authority. Realizing he could not rule directly, he installed a royal prince named Ziying as a puppet under the diminished title of king. Ziying understood the arrangement perfectly. Zhao Gao controlled every layer of the outer bureaucracy, every minister, every guard rotation, every dispatch rider. The only allies Ziying could trust were those who had never existed in Zhao Gao's administrative orbit. His two sons and a eunuch named Han Tan, who had served in the inner chambers long enough to understand what the system did to people who spoke out of turn. For 5 days, Ziying refused to attend his own coronation, claiming illness and sealing himself in his fasting quarters. Reports of rebel advances filtered through palace corridors. Territory lost, garrisons overrun, supply lines severed. Zhao Gao, impatient and overconfident, did exactly what Ziying needed. He left his power base and personally entered the fasting quarters to demand compliance. The moment he crossed that threshold, he stepped out of the sphere of his military protection and into the only domain where physical proximity still carried lethal weight. Han Tan emerged from behind a screen and drove a blade into the most powerful man in the empire. A genuine eunuch, castrated, invisible, unrecorded until that single act ended the life of the man 2,000 years of history would falsely remember as one of his own kind. Zhao Gao's entire clan was exterminated in the aftermath. Han Tan vanishes from every historical record at precisely this moment. The one moment he mattered to history lasted seconds. The silence that followed has lasted 22 centuries. Ziying had removed the parasite. He could not save the host. He reigned for 46 days. When the rebel leader Liu Bang arrived at the outskirts of the capital, Ziying surrendered, binding a white silk ribbon around his neck in submission. Liu Bang, counseled by his advisors, showed restraint. He sealed the treasuries, locked the palaces, and withdrew to wait. The surviving palace staff, including whatever eunuchs and attendants remained, were left in place. Had Liu Bang maintained sole control, those survivors might have been folded into a new administration. Palace attendants knew the schedules, the corridors, the operational machinery of governance. They had always been useful to incoming rulers. But military supremacy belonged to Xiang Yu, a true aristocrat carrying a generational hatred for the Qing state. He had already demonstrated his capacity for annihilation. 200,000 surrendered Qing soldiers buried alive in a single operation at Xing'an. When his armies reached the capital, the mandate was not occupation. It was erasure. He executed Ziying and every surviving member of the royal clan. Then he gave the city to his soldiers. The historical record compresses the catastrophe into a single devastating line. He massacred the capital, killed the surrendered king, burned the palaces, and the fire burned for 3 months without extinguishing. He seized their treasures, goods, and women, and moved east. 90 days of continuous fire. Modern archaeological excavations at the Shenyang Palace site have confirmed what that sentence describes: thick layers of ash, charred structural pillars, and deposits of calcified red burnt earth so severe they transformed the building materials at a molecular level. Now, Every palace drama stages this moment as the burning of the legendary Epang Palace. Qin Shi Huang's impossibly vast pleasure complex consumed in spectacular flame, but comprehensive archaeological surveys of the Epang Palace site have found no evidence of fire, no ash layers, no burnt earth, nothing. The palace was never completed, the largest unfinished construction project in ancient China, a massive rammed earth platform with nothing above it. What Xiangyu burned was the real seat of governance. The Xianyang Palace complex is north of the Wei River, where the records were kept, the systems were managed, and the eunuchs lived. For the castrated men trapped inside those walls, the outcome was terminal. They could not flee to family estates because they had no families, could not feed themselves because the state granaries had ceased to function, and could not disappear into the countryside because their bodies marked them as palace property. Those not cut down by soldiers or consumed by fire were scattered into slavery or left to starve in the ruins. Men whose entire skill set had value only inside walls that were now ash. Han Tan, the eunuch who had altered the dynasty's final chapter with a single blade stroke, disappears from every source at this exact point. No record of execution, no record of escape, no record at all. The system that rendered him invisible in life guaranteed the same in death. When Liu Bang defeated Xiangyu and established the Han Dynasty in 202 BCE, he inherited a political wasteland. The educated bureaucrats who had administered the Qing state were dead. The institutional knowledge of the inner court had scattered with the ash. The new dynasty rebuilt from salvaged legal codes and surviving scribes. But when Han architects designed their new inner court, they designed it in the shadow of the man they still believed was a castrated schemer who had hijacked an empire. The thing is, they still believed the myth. Their solution followed its logic perfectly. If a palace official could manipulate the succession and slaughter the royal family, then every person permitted to serve near the emperor must be castrated, stripped of the capacity to produce heirs, establish independent families, or found rival dynasties through proximity to the throne. By the Eastern Han, this was imperial law. The policy designed to prevent another Zhao Gao produced something the Qing dynasty had never experienced: genuine eunuch dictatorships. By concentrating all imperial access, document control, and communication into the hands of a biologically isolated caste with no social connections outside the palace, the Han created a class whose only path to power, wealth, and survival was the emperor's personal favor. The green tablet selections, the timed encounters, the eunuch managed ledgers that determined which woman saw the emperor and which was quietly erased from the tray. Those systems have their own history and one that has been told in full. Every one of them was built on the premise that castrated men were safer custodians of the inner court than intact ones. The Eastern Han collapsed under the weight of that premise. The 10 regular attendants murdered the Grand General and triggered civil war. The Tang Dynasty saw eunuchs commanding imperial guards and deposing emperors. The Ming produced eunuch dictators who controlled the secret police and overrode the entire traditional bureaucracy. Every one of those catastrophes was structurally enabled by a policy built on a lie about a man who was never castrated in the first place. The castrated men of the Qing dynasty lived as products of a penal system that measured human bodies by height, rationed them by grain weight, and discarded them when the machine no longer required fuel. A genuine eunuch drove a blade into the empire's actual destroyer, and the record went silent before the aftermath had settled. Then the fires came. The ash covered the Wei River Valley, and the only version of the story that survived was the wrong one. That wrong version shaped who could walk the corridors of power for the next 2,000 years, who would be cut to earn access, who would serve behind the curtain, and what form of control those men would eventually seize. The dynasties that followed tried to ensure it could never happen again. But the Qing dynasty did not fall because a eunuch whispered the wrong words. It fell because an unchecked bureaucrat held the right ones, and the only person close enough to stop him had learned, at the cost of everything, that silence was the price of breathing.